The story of the budget. Now, so the backdrop is, economy getting better than it might have been. So what happened, and why did we get the budget that we had, and what is the story of it? It's always quite interesting for me to see where the money is spent. I mean, one of the things we had yesterday was a cap on welfare spending going forward. As you can see, it's called social protection. Essentially, that's what we used to call social security. That's easily the biggest item of government spending. Accounts for getting on for a third of all government spending. And then you see the other components there: health, which has been ring-fenced. Education is more or less ring-fenced, and all the rest, some of which have had to suffer the biggest cuts. So outside. So far, at least, outside welfare or social security, health and education have been where the cuts have come. So defense, law and order, all those other things, local government has suffered quite big cuts. And I say it's always quite interesting to see, where the money is spent and how it is raised. I mean, it's unfortunate they put other up the top there. I would have put one of the name taxes, but income tax is obviously the most important tax. VAT is also extremely important. National insurance, national insurance is sometimes regarded as a sort of hidden tax, but it's for employers it's very important. For employees, it's extremely important. One of the debates about what they've done on the personal allowance was whether that should have been switched for the lower paid into raising the national insurance lower earnings limit, but that didn't happen. But I say it's quite interesting to see where the taxes come from. And as you will know, when we take income tax there, the distribution of income tax payments is incredibly uneven, in this country. So the top 1% of earners pay 30% of income tax, which is quite a lot of money. So more than 50 billion comes from the top 1% of earners in income tax alone, but also in other forms of tax. What was the message? Well, underlying that recovery theme, for the second time in a row, Osbourne was able to announce that the official forecasts, which are now done independently by the Office of Budget Responsibility, have been revised up. They were revised up in December in the autumn statement. They've been revised up again. GDP will return to its pre-crisis peak soon, but also, employment strength continuing. I think it will be, and we're seeing in the unemployment figures some quite significant falls in unemployment at the moment. I mean, unemployment is still on the measure they prefer, a little over 7%, but the claimant count is quite interesting. I mean, the claimant count has, in our lifetimes, has been well over 3 million. It's now heading down to below 1 million. And importantly, and I suppose the two things at the bottom, in terms of the political debate, have become very important. Inflation has come down to just below the target. That looked unlikely even a few months ago. And the official expectation is that we'll see, on average, earnings growing more than inflation. Now, the picture, I think, is a little bit more interesting than that if you dig down into the earnings figures, which I'll do in a second. But that's been an important political target for Labour, that the cost of living squeeze, the fact that on the monthly figures produced by the Office of National Statistics, average earnings are not rising as much as inflation. If that starts to turn around, if it's starting to turn around 15 months before the election, that's obviously quite good for the coalition parties. So I think that is an important and it's one of the reasons why I think a lot of people get the recovery wrong. The assumption has been that it's all out of people running down their savings. It's all driven by consumers. None of that is particularly true. The contribution of consumer spending to this recovery is lower than its usual share of GDP. So this is not particularly consumer-driven, and it's not driven by higher debt or an aggressive rundown of savings. It may be driven by the fact that average earnings are doing somewhat better than the figures suggest. This is a different job market, and one of the interesting things, and we don't really know why this is, that if you look at previous recessions, including previous milder recessions, recessions that didn't have as big a fall in GDP, they had they had big falls in employment. This one was a big one in terms of the fall in GDP. And the contrast I sometimes like to draw is between this recession, or the 2008-9 recession, and the recession of the early 90s. Recession of the early 90s, you saw GDP fall by 2.5% from peak to trough. You saw employment fall by 6.5%. This time, it was almost a mirror image. GDP fell by a little bit more than 6.5%, but employment only fell by 2.5%. And it has risen subsequently, as you can see. So the current cycle is the black line there. A much stronger employment picture than you would expect. And it's not quite clear why this is. There are many explanations for it. Maybe firms have preferred to recruit than invest. Maybe it's because of the changing nature of the economy. Maybe it's because people have been prepared to price themselves into jobs in a way that, in a more unionized past, they weren't prepared to do so. But it's been a quite interesting change. And the other thing which I think is really interesting, and I'm quite gratified that the Treasury put this in its budget documents, because I wrote about this recently. If you look at average earnings overall, then it seems that the squeeze has been long and quite intense, because inflation has been high, earnings growth has been low. This one measures people in an official survey, the annual survey about hours and earnings, who have been in continuous employment, by which they mean employment for more than a year. And that's the black line at the top. And I don't know whether this reflects, the experience, your experience, or the experience of the people you employ, but for people who've been in continuous employment in the public sector as well as in the private sector, and in the public sector we hear of people getting virtually no headline increase, but increases because of annual increments, promotion within bands and so on. And that does seem to have been quite widespread. So for people who've been in continuous employment, defined as in employment for more than a year, they have enjoyed average earnings increases which, except for 1 year, which was 2011, have beaten inflation. And and those people are 2/3 of all people in work. So it's an interesting phenomenon. It suggests to me that the squeeze on real earnings has been rather less than it's often painted, and rather less than it's played up by the opposition. This is the new forecast for growth. I mean, actually, the OBR from which this chart is taken. This is one of the famous fan charts that the Office of Budget Responsibility uses. The Bank of England uses them as well. I always say about these, it's a great way of presenting forecasts, because you can never be entirely wrong. But the black line in the middle is the one that we're looking at, and that suggests that growth will be good this year, 2.7%. It may slip back a little in 2015, and then resume at around about a little bit more than 2.5%. And that forecast is pretty good. It's not great. It's a little bit lower than the Bank of England, which is more optimistic. They see growth at around about 3%, almost indefinitely. So they are more optimistic about things. But we're in the kind of 2.5% to 3% range, which is not bad, and certainly better than we've been through. And the reason it should last, I think, is that we are seeing credit growth returning. Credit growth is returning both because we've reached that point in the cycle where the credit cycle, the credit mechanism is being repaired after the banking crisis. But also, official schemes like funding for lending and help to buy are doing it. But also, growth should last because we're seeing a pickup in investment, and we're seeing the return of real income growth. So these are the things you would look for, to distinguish between a recovery that is a flash in the pan and one that's got a reasonable chance of lasting. I won't use the word resilience, but one that has a reasonable chance of lasting. The public finances are looking somewhat better. Of course, we are still talking about budget deficits. So that in any past pre-crisis, any recent history before the crisis hit would be regarded as extraordinarily high. So we've got a budget deficit of more than 100 billion this year. A few years ago, a budget deficit of 50 billion would have been regarded as horrendous. So the fact that it's still more than 100 billion, it's come down from nearly 160 billion. So progress is being made, and progress should continue. I mean, the great fear, as I say, a year ago, was that this was going into reverse. It's not gone into reverse. It's still continuing. And you get to the point, in a few years' time where Government debt continues to go up, but it starts to fall relative to GDP if all goes according to plan and if recovery continues. And again, another of these fan charts, but this one for public borrowing. And you can take with a slight pinch of salt the idea that by the end of this decade we've suddenly got the healthiest public finances ever. There's many a slip, including the election to go through. But things are now on a downward path. I mean, originally the downward path was intended to be somewhat steeper than it is now, but it is going in the right direction. So that is encouraging. Now, what about the specific things in the budget? Was it a budget for investment? Well, I think if I was detecting a pattern for the budget, and you saw it in the speech, for those of you who watched the speech, that the Chancellor acknowledged the representations that he had and said, CBI has urged me to keep the investment allowance going for another year or so, etc. And then he took those representations and he beat them. He went a bit further than they expected. So the main demand from the business lobby groups was maintain the £250,000 investment allowance. He maintained and doubled it. The same with the bingo tax. The call was reduce it from 20 to 15%. Instead, he reduced it from 20 to 10%. So that was the pattern of it. This will make a difference. It will. I think doubling the investment allowance did what the business lobby groups wanted. It was important for this budget to be received positively by business, which it has been. And similarly with, I think there was enough there in terms of responding to some of these other concerns that the particular industries have made, on things like high energy costs. So on high energy costs, you say, we'll support fracking, we'll support shale gas, but in the meantime, we'll give you some extra support. So energy-intensive industries had been pleading for help on energy costs, so that was quite important. So it was there were measures there which I think will help to reinforce what does seem to be a recovery in investment. So we've already seen investment gradually picking up from its trough in 2009. And I think that will continue. So, investment is now starting to make a decent contribution to economic growth, business investment. Businesses have been very cautious about investing, but over the past year, business investment is up by 8.5%. Similar increase expected. And I think it was, to a certain extent, a budget for investment. That was quite positive, I think. Was it a budget for exporters? Well, I think it's very difficult to, export credit is useful and essential for many exporters, and so that will help. Reforming air passenger duty so you don't discriminate against flights to the BRIC economies is also quite useful as a two-way thing. None of this, of course, will transform Britain's export performance. None of it means that sort of overnight we'll suddenly become Germany, and you wouldn't expect that. So these are sort of quite small incremental changes. I mean, I think if you want greater success with exports, this goes deep into business culture and industrial culture and so on. So it takes a long time to turn these things around. It means building up, component industries in the case of the car industry and lots of things. So these are very long-term things. This helps fractionally at the margin. So I'd question whether it was a genuine budget for exporters. It was very definitely a budget for savers. Now, the budget for savers element went much further than I think people had expected. You may remember that the main thrust of the campaign from the savings industry beforehand was just to allow people who invested in ISAs, people who bought ISAs, freedom to choose which proportion was in cash and which proportion was in stocks and shares. And this was, and so I think the most the industry expected was that the limit on cash ISA, the cash ISA proportion, which was 50% of the total ISA limit, would be liberalized. So there'd be no restriction. So combining that with raising the limit to 15,000 was really, I think, quite bold and went further than the savings industry had expected. And this, I think, will be quite far-reaching in its impact. I mean, effectively, it means that for people putting money into cash ISAs, they can put in nearly 3 times as much as they could before the budget announcement. Other things to help pensioners in particular with a new national savings pensioner bond. And this responds, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see that this is, the squeezed people who they are very keen to bolster. And they think saving is a good thing, in general. But the key element here is, a lot of older people feel, quite cheated by low interest rates and by persistent low interest rates. They have relied on, maybe a 4 or 5% return on their savings, which they've had over a number of years, a large number of years. Suddenly to go down to, 1% at best has been a real problem for many older families and older savers. So this is directly responding to that, and you can't really criticize a budget which I think produces new incentives for savings. I think that was, that's quite positive. It's, if this had been it doesn't cost very much actually, but if this has been a giveaway aimed at increasing consumer spending, then you could say it was a pre-election gimmick. A giveaway that is targeted for savers, I think, is about as prudent a giveaway as you can get. So I think this is quite a good thing, and it was a big budget for pension reform. This is the biggest and most long-lasting element of the budget. This is the one, in terms of, in a year's time, in 2 years' time. I mean, last Sunday in the Sunday Times, I wrote that I struggled to recall last year's budget. That was not a memorable budget. Most budgets aren't memorable. This one will be memorable because of the pension reform, and which I think will be extremely far-reaching. And we'll, again, just as we'll be talking about the crisis for years to come, we'll be talking about the reform of pensions for years to come. Now, this is the way the Treasury represented it. And it's slightly odd in the sense that it looks that as though there is more choice now than there will be in the next slide I'll show, which is the reform system. But essentially, I mean, what this is saying is, if you're in a defined contribution scheme and you reach retirement, your choices are pretty awful at the moment. People may disagree, but you either buy an annuity, and annuity rates are very low, and you get locked into a low annuity rate, or you can withdraw, but the tax charge on withdrawal is extremely high. Of course, you've still got the 25% lump sum. Speculation that was going to be tackled did not happen. So a complex system, but one which gives people who reach retirement very limited choice. So one which is essentially a nanny knows best system. Buy an annuity. That's the thing that everybody does. Other options, but no options that really give genuine freedom. And this is intended to be the new system that, and the main difference, of course, is that you can withdraw at your marginal rate of tax, and you can, or you can have drawdown. There will still be people who take out annuities for good reason, but the new system will be simpler and will offer people retiring a much more palatable choice. Now, there'll be a huge debate about this. I mean, this was not necessarily a policy that you had to unveil in a budget. It could have been a white paper, a consultation. You talk to the industry, and then you end up with what you want to do. But I think it was, as budget rabbits go, the rabbit out of the hat in the budget, this was an interesting one, an unexpected one, as we saw from some of the share price movements yesterday, and I think will be the defining memory of this budget. I mean, George Osbourne, I think, has been keen to leave a legacy which will rank alongside, other chancellors. This was the Osbourne reform of X, Y, and Z. And so far, I don't think he's had one of those. I mean, he will be known for the chancellor who took over a large budget deficit and had to reduce it. But this, I think, gives him a reasonable opportunity of being associated with something which I think is overall beneficial. I think it seems to me to be a good thing to do, and as I say, will be affecting people for many years to come. And it is a very substantial reform. So, if I could sum up, overall, was it a game changer in a macroeconomic sense? Did it suddenly give us a stronger recovery? Did it do something to bring the deficit down faster? No, it wasn't. You know, this took the fact that the economy is recovering. It rode on that recovery and assumed and did one or two things at the margin that will help it along. But in macroeconomic terms, it was not a huge event. At the margin, as I said earlier, you know, there is help for investment, which could be quite useful, and for exports, which is probably a bit more marginal. But the savings and pensions changes, I think, are the big things of this budget. So the ISA move, I think, is pretty significant. I think that will have an effect. It will have an economic effect. It will have a political effect over a number of years. But the pension reform is potentially very far-reaching. I think that genuinely is a kind of a game changer as far as the pensions industry is concerned. So, you know, that is one where people will be debating that, debating how it actually comes out. And of course, it's not just, I mean, it's been portrayed in quite a lot of this morning's papers as reforms for the grey vote, for the pensioner vote. You know, existing pensioners will not, in the main, benefit from this. It is mainly people who perhaps are only in their 40s or 50s now who will be the first beneficiaries of this change, because it will take a while to come through. But interesting, far-reaching, and I'm glad to say, gave me something to talk about this morning. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.